Okay, so today I'm here with Michael Reed of AuthenticAstrology.com. He's a fellow student of Ernst Wilhelm, and we corresponded briefly over email and thought it might be a good idea to have a little conversation, a little interview to talk about some astrological points, talk about his practice, and just have a conversation, one astrologer to another, and see if something interesting came out of it to share with you all today. So I'd like to introduce Michael Reed of Authentic Astrology. Here you are. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing well. Hello, Ryan. It's good to be here, and it's good to finally connect with you person to person, albeit through lots of wires and cables and ethers and everything.
Right. Good. And where are you located? I believe you're in England, or?
I'm in the UK. I'm an American citizen, but my wife is from the UK, so we live in the UK.
Okay. And how long have you been there?
We've been here for a good solid year off and on at this point, yeah.
Okay.
But I've lived in the UK off and on over and over again over the course of the last 6-7 years. We've lived sometimes in the States, sometimes in the UK.
Right. Excellent.
Living over here now, so.
Good. Well, one thing I always like to ask people when I do meet an astrologer for the first time to chat, as we are doing today, is what prompted your interest in Vedic astrology, and what was your path that essentially brought you to where you are now as a Vedic astrologer?
Wow, well, that's a very deep question and a very long one to ask. So I'll try to give you a short answer to it.
Okay.
I've always just had a natural affinity to Vedic philosophy. Back in the early 90s, I started, reading versions of the Rig Veda and things along those lines because I was just interested in it. I was fascinated with Indian culture, and so I just began to pour myself into everything that I could read at that point. And at one point, I also was living with another astrologer, another well-known astrologer, and I began to get into Western astrology through living with him, and began to work with practicing Western astrology and using Western astrological techniques. And at a certain point, I had a Vedic astrology consultation. And the thing that really kind of pulled me in was I sat in the chair next to the astrologer. And he asked me a few questions about my father that probably took him about 3 or 4 seconds to ask. And he goes, "Oh, you were actually born 1 minute and 10 seconds earlier."
Interesting.
And so I was going, "Okay, how do you know that?"
Right.
Now I kind of figured out how he did that, but at that point it was just really kind of fascinated me.
Uh-huh.
And I won't go into detail about how he did that. That's another question. But so then I just began to study Vedic astrology. I was also a Kundalini yoga teacher, and so it all just began to fit together. And I began to find when I started studying Vedic astrology that everything in my life that I had done over the course of my life all of a sudden began to come together, because I had a background in radio at one point. So I started, doing some, astrology shows with another astrologer, the astrologer I was living with at that point, and began to put together my radio skills with my astrological skills, and everything just kind of began to gel. And next thing I know, I'm, doing tons and tons of consultations because I started working with another astrologer's backlog after I had done enough practice to be able to do good consultations for people. And it was just immediate like that. And since then, it's been an up and down ride, but it's been a
right.
a ride that lets me know that I'm on the path that's the right path.
Good. And I think I read in your bio. So do you practice Western and Vedic, or is that something you did do? Have you merged them? And where are you now in that particular approach to astrology?
Well, I know that we were also considering talking briefly about Ernst's system, but why don't we talk about how I approach astrology?
Sure.
I do tend to work with the outer planets, Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune. I've even begun to incorporate Chiron and Hygeia through the lunar mansions and Nakshatras, and I've begun to find a lot of very powerful information through doing so. So I use predominantly Vedic astrology techniques, which, of course, when I'm dealing with the outer planets, such as Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune, I'm using the Tajika aspects, the squares, sextiles, trines, things along those lines. and always incorporating the lunar mansions within that. And I have just found it to be such a very wonderful system in terms of providing more depth and understanding. My approach to astrology with my clients tends to be more interactive. I do offer written reports through my site and also personalized video reports, but I really like doing one-to-one consultations with people. Because I find when you're engaging in a dialogue with a client and if they're willing to work in this way, you can get them in a therapeutic dialogue and they will often say things that kind of clue you in on something else that you need to take a look at. And then it really becomes this experiential journey that you're able to take together through their astrology. You can do some pretty profound work that way. And I've just found a lot of the Western astrological techniques in conjunction with the Vedic astrological techniques to really provide some very deep and profound information in a manner that seems to combine the more psychological side, which would be more closely associated with Western astrology, with the karmic soul-related side of what the individual is dealing with, which is more connected to Vedic astrology. And I find when you combine both of those, then you really tend to be able to get to some pretty deep places with some of the clients.
Right. And that brings up an important point. You hit on a bunch of topics that I do want to look at as we go through, particularly the Nakshatras. I know that's on our agenda to talk about. But you bring up a pretty good point, I think, in regards to when you have a conversation with clients, that helps key you in on maybe what to look at within a birth chart. And the only reason I bring that up is because there are two things. First, I found that usually, and maybe you've seen this too, that when sometimes when clients approach an astrologer, they have this idea that the astrologer should know everything from the very beginning just by looking at the chart. And I do think you can know a lot just by looking at the chart, but there's so much in the chart. For example, there are the divisional charts, there's the Logitati of Ashtas, there's looking at the dashas, there's looking at Jaimini, Parashara, and even within the chart itself, you can read the chart from each different house. For example, if you want to know about fourth house matters, you look at the chart from that perspective. So you can spend hours just looking at the birth chart without even considering the Vargas. And so, and so the point that I just kind of wanted to make here is that having a conversation, or one thing that I like to do, because a lot of my sessions have been, actually most of them are pre-recorded nowadays, is to take an intake form that just gives some ideas about, what specifically are you interested in, what are some past issues. And one interesting example was a woman I worked with who we looked at some dates that dealt with where she gained a lot of wealth by going to a casino. And in her chart, she had the combinations for wealth and for gambling, oddly enough. And she picked these two dates where she won quite a lot of money. And so we went and we analyzed those two dates. So she gave me the information. We analyzed those two dates. And then we looked to see when our transits and when our dasha is going to line up again, possibly to give those things. And we found the dates, and she actually went to the casino and made almost 10 grand again by on those two dates. And the point being that one of the things I think that a lot of people miss about astrology is that some background information and building rapport with an astrologer really helps you to dial in to what's going on in the chart and understanding how to give the best information to an individual. And it sounds like for you that comes through the the verbal communication, the just the conversational aspect of the whole reading.
Exactly. And it's I like to tell my clients that the more information they give me can create a difference between trying to find a needle on a farm and finding a needle in a haystack.
Right.
So if you begin to narrow it a little bit, it helps me know what you're wanting to look for. Otherwise, I'm just looking all over your chart and I'm going to pull out, mainly things you're interested in. But if you come to me and say, how is my career going to be?
Right.
That's different than saying, how is my career going to be over the next few years?
Exactly.
Or, my career has not been so good lately because of this, and I would really like for it to be like this. Can you help me to find a way to do that? And if clients can, help to, pinpoint their questions a little bit, I find us astrologers can really help them even more. And it's not so much about, wowing the client, with our techniques of what we're able to do. It's much more about, we're here to help you. And so we can help you. If you help us, we can help you even deeper.
Right, right, yeah. And I always think back to, we'll move off the subject here in a moment, but I find it important to discuss. It's like also when a person goes to a doctor, sure, it might be obvious that they show up at the doctor and their arm's ripped off. The doctor then knows obviously that they have a serious problem with their arm. But if they have something going on internally, the doctor gets information. There's an Ayurvedic practitioner in town that I have tea with often, and they have diagnosis, they take intakes, they look at these certain things so that they can further zero in on what's going on for the client. So the Vedic sciences, Vedic astrology, personally, I don't see it any different than any other science. The more information that you start with, the easier it works. Now, there are things that are obvious. You can look at a person's chart and pick out quite a lot. But I feel when it comes to really getting into the meat of what a client needs, obviously it's best to get some guidance in that regard. So yeah, that's good. Good.
Yeah, more background. I find background too, like what's going on in your life at present is always helpful.
Right, exactly. And the best experiences I've had with clients personally, it sounds like you do too, is when they are understanding that it's a conversation.
Yeah.
That we're looking at the chart, we're looking at the collection of karma, and I'll say what I see, and then you respond as to how you've worked with that, and then we're able to work to see how it all fits together. And those have been really some of the best sessions I personally have had too. So
exactly. I mean, just to kind of give you an example, like if I have a client and they're going, well, I want to do this, but I just find that I don't really have the time. Immediately, my head's going to go, what's happening with Saturn in this person?
Yeah.
And I'm going to go look at that and look at, where, Saturn is in their birth chart, what nakshatra it's in their birth chart, any transits that's happening to that. And then I'm going to start going into that in order to help them with the problems they're having.
Right.
And that's been really helpful for them.
Right. And, you brought up the nakshatras again. And my next question was, what aspect of Vedic astrology most intrigues you? And I think it's probably the nakshatras based on our correspondence that we've had so far. Is that true?
I would say I always come back to the nakshatras, but I'm one of those people who is a lifelong student. So different things are always interesting me at different times. I'm just completely fascinated by Vedic astrology, and there's so much to learn and so much to incorporate, and you can always expand upon what you know and study further and go deeper and deeper into things. But the things that I find always tend to be the cornerstone of the work that I do comes back to the nakshatras and their influence. And I tend to find that with a lot of Vedic astrology and how it's used, most recently, that there's not a lot of people who are really using the nakshatras to the depth that they can be used. In other words, understanding what each nakshatra is about, what the energy of that nakshatra is about, and how it functions, rather than just knowing that the first navamsha or the first pada of a certain nakshatra is going to place a planet here,
right.
Which is the ninth divisional chart. If you go into the meaning of those nakshatras and you understand how a planet's impact in that nakshatra is going to activate different aspects of that nakshatra, you can really start to get some pretty profound information.
Right.
Taking, for instance, if you don't mind, Anuradha, which is where Saturn is transiting at present. Saturn rules Anuradha. Anuradha has several different things with it. On one level, it's about potential. It's also about balance within relationships, and it's also about devotion. So Saturn transiting there is going to bring out more of the devoted, passionate, sometimes even to the extent of being stubborn within that field. Right? Right.
Well, it's interesting. My moon is in Anuradha, so I can relate a little bit to that at the moment. Well, that's with the nakshatras. I probably don't use them as detailed as you do, which is a good thing, because this can help me with the conversation. I haven't found a lot of I haven't found a lot of information on the nakshatras coming from older texts. You know, there are a lot of people who have written on the nakshatras, and I have a number of those books, and they all seem to approach them in a little bit different way. For example, when I use the nakshatras, one of the things that I do is I consider the ruler of the nakshatra, not the planet, but the deity that rules the nakshatra, and what that represents, the energy behind it. And then I try to imagine if that planet was in that nakshatra, how would that planet channel, or how that planet give life or a body to that kind of divine energy. So, you know, if it's Mars, it could be more of an aggressive energy, but we'd have to see what nakshatra is that to see how could Mars channel in an aggressive way. You know, this is very, very basic. In an aggressive way, this particular nakshatra energy. So this is how I use it, just to get a sense of how the planets give to help refine the interpretation. But for you, like, what would be an example of how you would approach the nakshatras? Does that even make sense based on
what you said makes a lot of sense, and I haven't particularly done that approach, but that's a good way, I think, to approach it. That's actually maybe something that I'll experiment with too.
Okay.
I tend to sometimes take a rather broad approach to the nakshatra, covering both polarities of it with the individual, and sometimes if they're in a therapeutic dialogue with me, engaging them in a therapeutic dialogue about that. Let's say, for instance, with Anuradha, if the person's having relationship problems, we're going to go directly into that concept of you needing to find balance within the relationships, because it's quite likely that you give too much of yourself away to your partner, and you don't include yourself in the giving, and you forget to give to yourself, which is an important factor too. And many people forget that in order to be selfless, you have to include yourself in the giving.
Right.
Because otherwise you're draining yourself and you can't give to somebody.
Right.
But what I also like to do with the nakshatras, and one of the ways that I learned and began to integrate to work with them, is to look at the planetary ruler of the nakshatra too, and look at how it's disposed in the chart. Right? If it's in a difficult house, it may begin to bring out more of the negative polarity of that nakshatra.
Okay, so you're saying that you look at, just not to interrupt, well, yes, to interrupt, because I want some more clarification. So what you're saying is you look at the planetary ruler of the nakshatra, and then maybe you find out by dignity, or possibly even the Lajatati Vastu, maybe dignity, whether it's a debilitated, good friend, exalted, and if the dignity is better, then you have a sense that the energy of that nakshatra will come through in its purest sense, or clearer sense, or is it more of a benefic, malefic influence?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
And for instance, as well, if a planet is a cruel planet, right, and it's occupying its own nakshatra, obviously it's going to bring out a lot of the more positive qualities of that nakshatra in some ways, because that planet is strong for that nakshatra. But you also have to look at the fact of the cruel or gentle impact upon the nakshatra too.
Right. Okay. Wow.
So if you have Mars and Anuradha, it's going to excite more of the passion and the devotion that's there. Right? If Mars is well disposed, let's say Mars is in Capricorn, like it is right now, it could have more of a positive impact on that. Just as a for instance. And I begin to work with the information like that, but I also work with the feedback of the client in terms of what they're expressing and what they're voicing. One of the things, along these lines, just to give you perhaps a little bit further clarity on it, let's use MAGA, for example. I have found that pretty much without fail, when I have a client who's coming to me and they have a powerful malefic, I like using the word cruel instead, a powerful cruel planet in MAGA, there is usually some sort of parental or ancestral issue that they're shouldering from their ancestors. They have a very difficult time with.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
Quite often I've also found, just one more briefly, that if you have somebody who has something like Venus in MAGA, or they also have a lot of planets that exhibit healing capacity, you'll find that person has more of a shamanic approach to healing.
Okay.
If they're used to ancestral techniques, that's how that influence begins to come through.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, when I think back over past charts and, charts I know very well. So do you have any, I mean, I think I've seen on your website that you do have, is it an audio course that you have available for download? Or am
In
I?
terms of doing learning Vedic astrology. Or,
Yes.
yeah,
Well, I'm kind of curious if you'd ever consider doing a Nakshatras course, because I know a lot of people are interested in this. And
I'm
it
doing
seems,
not to do one at present. I'm looking to do that. But it's interesting because I find that there are some people who are interested, but they have a hard time committing. I've had more luck with teaching nakshatra courses, being completely upfront, which I do nothing but that. Had more luck with teaching nakshatra courses on the ground than I
okay.
have.
Yeah, well, we'll have to think about that a little bit more because number one, I think it's a great idea. Listening to the way you're describing how you use the nakshatras, it sounds very important.
Yeah.
The depth, the depth sounds very important. So, anyway, let's put that on the back burner. Let's talk about that when we
Okay. Yeah.
get done.
Otherwise, we could spend an hour talking about it because I'll get
Yeah,
too.
well, maybe you could spend a whole class talking about it.
Exactly.
So it sounds to me, moving on with the questions, that one of the things that you're really interested in working with clients is discussing more of, is it the psychological aspects, or is it more just helping them get a handle on how to work with their planets, which that is psychological, but really what is it that you enjoy discussing with clients that?
I I like it. I'm happy when any client comes to me because I feel that I'm hoping that I can help them in one way or another. So if somebody's coming to me for prediction, sure, I'm happy to help them. But I do have to say the people that I feel most comfortable working with are people who come to me and they're going, I want to know the whys.
Right.
Why is this happening in my life? So
Right.
that I can do what I need to do to harmonize whatever might be out of balance so that I can make a difference and so that I can evolve. When I get those people, then I know that I've got somebody who's willing to do some serious work on themselves and take a look at what's there.
Yeah, that is
My firm belief that if you kind of just do prediction without also doing the why behind that prediction, then in some instances you'll find you're just really kind of dealing with the symptom and not the root issue behind the situation. I always like to get people interested in going into the root issue behind why they're interested in knowing about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a.
Got it.
Those are the best. Yes, that is the best way. In my mind, that's the best way to approach it too, because then you have something to work with. It's not just, in 5 years your career is going to blow up. It's more like in 5 years you have the potential for this to occur, and here's what might lead up to it.
Yeah. Right.
So, good.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I found working, doing this work and doing YouTube videos and having clients is that oftentimes people will write to me, or even in a session, they'll focus on one planet, or they'll focus on, they'll say something like, I know my birth time is this because my moon is in this nakshatra, or whatever it might be. And I talked about this in another video at one point in time, but I got so tired of hearing that I actually went through and reread just that day all of the nakshatras and what they represent, what they can mean. And I realized that, I can relate to about 19 of these nakshatras, and many of those 19 nakshatras, I don't have any planets in at all. And so it started to occur to me that I wondered how can one express to a client or to someone who's asking about astrology that you can't focus on one particular planet. There's so many variables in the chart. So I'm wondering if you've had to deal with anything like that, and if so, how do you express to the client that an aspect of greatness doesn't come just because the sun is exalted, or an aspect of despondency or lack of success, it doesn't come just because Saturn is in your second house, that there's layers in that regard. How do you work with that, or how do you speak to that?
Well, what I generally, just to give you, for instance, there was recently a client who was, concerned because their moon, I don't remember which chart it was, their Jupiter actually was dead in one of their Vargas.
Right.
And so they were, so freaked out about, oh, well, this isn't going to mean that that's, going to be horrible. And I was like, well, yeah, but you have to consider the fact that that planet may not serve a purpose in one area of your life, but it's going to serve a purpose in another area of your life.
Right.
And it's so much more vast than just understanding the concept that this planet isn't functioning in this area, because then you're just going to give that planet a negative reputation in your chart, and you're going to, become more disharmonious with that planet or more dissonant with that planet in the first place. Instead, if you look at the fact that that might actually serve you in some other area of your life, the fact that it's not helping you in this area, then, in contrast, when a person is talking about an exalted planet and then they begin to wonder why that exalted planet isn't delivering all these really wonderful things in their life, then you have to go into some of the other things, because it's always more intricate than just an exalted planet. There's the aspects you have to think about, what's influencing that planet, what areas of your life it's giving that exaltation to, what areas of your life is it actually debilitated.
Yeah.
Debilitated somewhere else.
Right. That's one of the most valid points, I think, that you can have an exalted planet, but that planet may rule over something that you don't necessarily want exalted. It may also be that that exalted planet is getting starved. Logitati Vashta is overwhelmed by a lot of its enemies. And so while it's strong, it can give, it actually has more enemies, which takes it down, which also brings up the idea of debilitation. A lot of people focus on debilitation and they see that as terrible, but it may be that that planet, yes, is debilitated.
It can have debilitation canceled too.
Right. Its debilitation can be canceled, or it could have no enemies against it. There could be no negative impacts towards it. So it might be weak itself, but it's not getting attacked. And it might have all of its friends supporting it, so it can still do good things. And that's exactly the point I was trying to get at, that there are all these variables, and that we can't just say one planet is doing this. It's a holistic, and as you mentioned, the Vargas. Looking at each Varga, the planet's going to be in a different place and in a different dignity in each Varga, which means that in your career or the area of status, because I like to look at the Dassamsha as status more so than career, that it might be exalted there, which is great for the career aspect, but maybe in regards to the Chaturtamsha, where we're looking at wealth above and beyond one's means, it's debilitated, so it hurts you there. So again, this brings me back to that original issue. Yes, right. The original issue that even getting guidance from a client about how to approach the chart will be very helpful, because maybe they just want to know about finances. And so you can zero in on the second house, the fourth house, the 11th house, and those particular Vargas. And then you get excellent information specific to their needs. So excellent. All right. Well, I have one more topic I was hesitant to bring up. And I'll prompt that by saying why I'm hesitant to bring it up. Because in Vedic astrology, there's, as in all things, there are usually a polarized approach. And I find this in religion as well, that when someone thinks that their way is the best way, they often defend that and get very aggressive against that. And so you're probably wondering what I'm going to bring up now. But it's the idea of using the tropical zodiac with Vedic techniques. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because I know you do that, and I do that as well. But this is something that I was very much against for the first 10, 11 years of doing Vedic astrology, because I was of the belief that, the sidereal zodiac is the right way. I have a very strong Saturn and Mars, so I can be very, opinionated, I guess you could say. But then one of my teachers, Richard Fish, who co-authored the book, The Art and Science of Vedic Astrology, with me, he was a Western astrologer as well as a Vedic astrologer for about 30 years, but he did both. And he actually started to see that when he did a chart, he would get better results if he used the Vedic techniques, but also considered what those signs might look like if we used the tropical chart. And he just hinted at me a few times. And it wasn't until I discovered Ernst's methods that I saw that someone was doing this. And my first response was, that's crazy. This person is a heretic. He shouldn't be teaching astrology at all, because that's how I work in my mind. But I started to look at the charts, and I started to see this actually makes really good sense in regards to the sign energies. And when I did the traditional sidereal, I have to be honest, I rarely even considered the quality of a sign itself.
Yeah.
I've heard other Vedic astrologers who are still sidereal say that same thing, that they don't necessarily consider,
Yeah.
right, they don't necessarily consider the energy of the sign. And they still get good results. Why? Because, well, you know, different things are going to overlap, and your intuition is going to guide you. So I find that sidereal astrologers can do very good work, as well as tropical astrologers can do very good work. There's something else going on than just all the math. There's an intuitive aspect about it.
Yeah, right.
But for you, I'm just kind of curious, what got you doing this, other than the fact that you were a Western astrologer, but what kind of allowed you to come around to the idea that maybe doing tropical zodiac with Vedic techniques has some merit to it? You know, what was that like for you?
Well, mine kind of became somewhat of a natural approach. I'm one of those people who I tend to look at it, if something is in the collective unconscious, let's say, for instance, if we know that Uranus exists, or if we know that Pluto exists, then we know that that's there to be experimented with and worked with, because it's there. So it's there to be understood and to explore, right? And so I learned Vedic astrology purely from a sidereal perspective, that had always, you know, had an interest in Western astrology and the basis in Western astrology as well. And then when I discovered Kala Vedic astrology, Vedic astrology program, and discovered that there was a setting in it that let me keep the nakshatras in their sidereal position, but use the tropical signs, I was wowed. You know, I wasn't even aware Ernst was doing research at that point. I was just wowed by that, and I was going, wow, this gives me an opportunity to explore and experiment with this. So I started using Tajika aspects and using the lunar mansions and things like that, and began to play around with some of the, you know, Vedic techniques using the sidereal nakshatras and the tropical rashis, tropical signs. And I began to find that I was getting very good results, and something that was leading me towards an approach that I found was, or at least I felt, was combining the psychological aspects that are more prominent in Western astrology with the karmic soul path aspects that are present in Vedic astrology, and allowing me to combine them. In my head, I also began to have the thought of it's like East meeting West. You know, there's a little bit that can be gained from both.
Right.
And so I began to explore those concepts with it as well. And then when I discovered that, you know, research had been done that actually was beginning to prove that it was quite likely that it was always intended to use a tropical zodiac with sidereal nakshatras. And I know that may actually, you know, make some people feel perturbed to hear
Right.
that.
Well, and let me just, you keep going with your thought here in a minute, but I just would like to say that those of you who are thinking to yourself, oh no, what's going on? You can go to Ernst Wilhelm's site, or even my site, Astro Vedic Astrology, and he has a free class on Rashis and Ayanamshas that explains the theory behind why the tropical zodiac works. And again, you don't have to tell me. I know that it's a very charged subject, and so if you don't agree with it, fine, stick with your sidereal astrologer. But keep in mind that there have been good astrologers that do both tropical and Vedic throughout time. So there's something to both. So anyway, I just wanted to throw out there that, you know, if someone does want to research this more, that there is some articles, there is some recordings available to help explain it. So go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Sure. You know, so it was fascinating to me that this research was there and that it was being explored, and it began to, you know, make good sense to me. The ecliptic, which is what the zodiac is related to, the zodiac is really just 12 30-degree sections of the ecliptic. The ecliptic is the path of the sun over the course of the year, through the seasons. So therefore, the zodiac signs, the Rashi, should be looked at from a tropical perspective, because we're talking about the seasons. And we're talking about the relationship between the Earth and the sun within our solar system. So that's more of the macrocosmic concept. And then there's the individual concept that we're experiencing here on the planet, which is the individual incarnated in a body, trying to relate to their soul within this realm of consciousness, right?
Right.
Then you take that concept and then you expand beyond that, which is the nakshatras, the lunar mansions. It's only right that since they are extrasolar, outside of our solar system, not affected by the seasons, that they should be calculated sidereally.
Right.
And then I began to kind of have this concept coming, you know, to mind and coming to heart, that we're here incarnated within, on this planet. Some of us are on this planet. Sometimes I'm on several different planets at once, just on the day. But we're here incarnated on this planet, experiencing a relationship with our soul. And we can get this input from outside of that, from a more universal source.
Right.
It helps to awaken our consciousness and allow it to grow in certain areas. And so then I began to have this really good vision that sometimes I don't even know if I can express in words, of a more spiritual model that's related to how this system of using tropical signs and sidereal lunar matching comes into being. And I had used sidereal signs, zodiac signs, for such a long time. And once I switched to using this tropical system, everything just began to jump out at me.
Right.
It was so much clearer, so much cleaner, and I found that things were just, I wasn't having to search for things quite as much as having them just present themselves.
Right, and that was my experience too, is that, even though I fought it because I didn't want to believe it because it was wrong, when I started to actually really consider what I was seeing with the tropical chart, I couldn't ignore it. When I started even lining it up with Ayanamshas, let's not get into Ayanamshas today because there are over 10 different Ayanamshas anyway. But point being that when I started to see how that lined up, I couldn't refute the results. And even clients that I work with now, this isn't something that I usually tell people. It is in the very bottom of my first-time client letter that says, and I use the tropical zodiac with the Ayanamsha. So by responding to this email, you acknowledge that you understand this is what's going on. But what I found is even with clients who didn't read that or didn't know that I was doing that the accuracy was there, and it was even greater than what I had experienced previously using the sidereal, which was still pretty good. So one quick thing maybe we can end on as we're talking about this, the question that I always get is how can they actually both work? How could it be, they say, how can it be, Ryan, that for those 5 years that you were working on my chart with sidereal, it worked very well, but now you're using tropical and it still works very well. And one of the things that I found, just to kind of seed the conversation, is that there's just overlap. There can be so much overlap between the sidereal and the tropical chart. For example, someone might be a Leo ascendant in sidereal, but let's say that we then see that Mercury, they're Leo ascendant, and Mercury's in their 10th house. So that's going to give a mercurial quality to their career, and their personality is going to be have a bit of a sun influence to it, or their expression. But now we switch it to tropical, and now they're a Virgo ascendant, which speaks to the mercurial quality, and now their Atmakaraka is the sun, and maybe they have a lot of planets in Leo. So the point that I'm trying to get at here, just to get the conversation going, is that switching, it might be that certain things are there, but you're seeing them from a little bit different angle, which is why an astrologer who does sidereal might get good information, just like the astrologer who's using the tropical. So do you have any thoughts on that? Or, well, what might you say to someone who would ask, how can both of them work? How can you have been right as a sidereal astrologer and also now be really right as a tropical?
If I know that they have a technical mindset or some astrological knowledge, then I will say pretty much the exact same thing that you're saying.
Okay.
Give them an idea of how the two systems will overlap. If I'm dealing with somebody who has, just had a very brief experience with Vedic astrology, but now they're, a little bit concerned because they're recognizing that their paradigm has been a little bit, shifted in regards to that, I'll just explain to them very simply, the planets are always having a relationship to each other.
Right.
Regardless of how that energy is being expressed. It can be expressed this way or that way. So each astrologer is going to pick up on different aspects of it. You and I both using the same system, sure, we will, there will be confirmation because we're using the same system and we're using the same system scientifically. But because we're different astrologers, we might pull different information out of the chart.
Exactly.
In a little bit of a different way. So,
right.
The planets will interact in a different way and bring different information out in relation to the astrologer who's interpreting.
Mm-hmm. And this brings up one other important point. Well, actually, I should check in. Do you still have time? Can we keep going a little bit longer?
I have just a few more minutes.
Okay, okay. Well, and one final question.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll do this again because I'm enjoying the conversation.
Sure.
One final question is that so when you are talking to someone and you are using this new system, um, the point that I try to make to people is that the chart is not going to contradict your experience. So you mentioned a paradigm shift. And yes, there is a bit of a paradigm shift, but it's more so in just understanding how you work with the chart. It's not that all of a sudden your chart changes and so now, you know, the fact that your Jupiter was exalted and it's not, it doesn't change anything in regards to how it really was. It's just allowing you to have a little more insight into it. So is that anything that you noticed as well, or do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I would say exactly what you said just then, which is, you know, sure, somebody may have an exalted Jupiter in one system, but then it changes by the other system. But
Right.
that same flow of energy is going to come out in a different manner.
Exactly. Yeah, because you can't.
With a bit of extra depth or input on what that planet is about.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. Well, good. Well, we'll go ahead and conclude here.
Sure.
So those are all fun insights. And again, those of you who are watching who've stuck around to the end, don't get disturbed about, you know, which one is right. You will find the astrologer that's right for you and the system that's right for you. That's what has been my experience. So just thank you, Michael. And again, you can go to his website, AuthenticAstrology.com, and he has lots of good information, a good blog article there, and you can even schedule a session with him. And maybe if we can, we'll try to do this on a regular basis and talk about some of these more interesting issues of astrology. So thank you very much.
I'd love to, and thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
You too.